So the reality, folks, is that they are stealing elections. They're doing it pretty blatantly. The fact that we're not allowed to talk about it means we should talk about it even more. But the really sad reality is within a generation, they're not going to have to steal elections anymore. They will have this in the bag just because of what they're doing to our kids. Let's see. Here we go. Do I have this on? Yes. Okay. And is the receiver back there? Okay. So the data is really, really troubling. We've got some of the polling data. But first I want to start with a couple of scriptures as well. Let's see. It was working before. Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah, if we can get the remote working, that'd be great. But so this is important. I think this should be something that we just keep in mind as we go through the evening tonight. The Bible describes reality as basically a conflict between two sides, right? You've got the kingdom of God and then the kingdom of darkness. You've got Team Jesus and you've got Team Antichrist. And Jesus is actually quoted twice in the Gospels, once in Matthew and once in Luke. And he says very, very clearly, you're either with me or you're against me, right? There is no neutral ground. There is no secular space where you're either not with Christ and not with the enemy. You're either one or the other. And I think by the time we're done here, it should be very clear what side the government school system is on. And I intend to prove to you what's going on here. So let's go to the next one. Here's another scripture. This is Jesus talking again. He says, students are not greater than their teacher, but the student who is fully trained will become like the teacher. And so if that's what the Word of God says, and it is, we ought to take this very seriously. Who is teaching our children? Do we want to teach them? Do we want godly teachers for them? Or do we want guys like this with interesting costumes teaching our children? Because it's a fact that our children are going to be very strongly influenced by who is educating them. Let's go to the next one. Here's the polling data I mentioned. This is really troubling. Millennials, and I always hesitate to admit I'm a millennial because people just assume you're an idiot, and it's not wholly unjustified. But among millennials, 70% of my generation, they say socialism is the way of the future. They say they're going to vote for socialists. More than a third of them are into communism. And I always say, I'll get you a one-way ticket to Cuba or North Korea or the utopia of your choice. And at only condition, you got to stay for 6 months. And when you get back, you got to kiss the ground and apologize to all of us for your silliness. Nobody ever takes me up on that. They just want to mess up our country. But this is the reality, folks. Within a generation, these are going to be the ones serving as CEOs of companies. These are going to be the ones in political office. These are going to be the dominant voting bloc. We are on the fast track to Venezuela, if we're lucky, if something doesn't change here. On the religious front, it's even more alarming. For the first time in all of American history, we've got a generation where Christians are in the minority. And these are self-proclaimed Christians. Less than half of millennials say they are Christian. A majority of millennials say they are not Christian. And this is unprecedented in American history, never before. I mean, even as late as the 1990s, well over 90% of Americans still said they were Christian. And yet we have this crisis going on. And actually, if you talk to the 49 or 48% of millennials who still say they're Christian, you'll find out very quickly many of these have no idea what that means. They have no relationship with Christ. They have no idea what the Bible says. They're Christian because mom and dad took them to church every once in a while growing up. They're not Christians in the true sense. So this is a crisis, folks. Our country's not going to survive this. And this is interesting. Totalitarians for the last 100 years have understood very clearly that if you want to seize and keep power, you got to brainwash the kids. Adolf Hitler, of course, a National Socialist leader, he was wrong about virtually everything, but he was right about this. He alone who owns the youth gains the future. And of course, he wasn't alone. Chairman Mao understood that. Joseph Stalin understood that. I actually quoted this Hitler quote at a Moms for Liberty event, and then the lying fake media. This will tell you how dishonest they are. They say, Alex Newman quoted Adolf Hitler, and Moms for Liberty hosted Alex Newman. Therefore, Moms for Liberty must be a Nazi group. Okay. Any of you who know me or any of you who have listened to me for more than 30 seconds know that I'm quoting Hitler to make a point. These are dangerous, wicked individuals, and they want the hearts and minds of your children, right? So they didn't technically lie. I did actually quote Hitler. They just didn't give you, the rest of the story. And so that's how Moms for Liberty became a Nazi group. Fun fact. The lengths that they will go to. And I actually feel very reassured when they do stuff like that because, I've been speaking out for over a decade. I've written thousands of articles. the best you could do is make something up? I mean, you couldn't come up with anything that I said that you wanted to quote to make me look bad? Man, I must be doing something right. So anyways, with the grace of God. I want to show you a clip here. This whole idea that they're going to own the minds of our children, as Adolf Hitler and so many other totalitarians have pointed out, this is now our reality in this country, and they're telling us that they want the minds of your children. In a moment, I'm going to show you the Secretary of Miseducation, Miguel Cardona, serving for Joe Biden. Here he is talking about children and who should be in charge.
Fairly quick answers here because I want to get to Secretary Becerra. Do you think parents should be in charge of their child's education as the primary stakeholder?
I believe parents are important stakeholders, but I also believe educators have a role in determining educational programming.
And I think that's going to be a little out of focus.
Yeah. All right, let's make this clear. I'm not a stakeholder in the education of my children, okay? I'm in charge, along with my wife, of the education of my children. And if I choose to delegate some of those tasks to others, I'm still in charge. I'm not a stakeholder, okay? Primary or otherwise. And yet, the Secretary of Education can't even bring himself to say parents are the primary stakeholders. You could take a back seat. And this is actually the policy of the U.S. government. They put out a document in the last year of the Obama administration, or Obama regime. Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Education, there was a document on family engagement. They said parents could be equal partners with the government in the education and the raising of their children. And as you read the document, you'll find out very quickly they don't mean equal partners at all. Not that even that would be appropriate. As you read it, it's very clear that the government wants to be the senior partner, you are the junior partner, you do what they say, or they have an escalating list of interventions, starting with parenting classes, mandatory parenting classes, up to and including kidnapping your children from you. So this is the direction that they're moving in. This is the big man himself, the big guy himself, sorry.
Look, these aren't, we always talk about these children. They're not someone else's children. They're our children.
Yeah, no, Joe Biden, they're not your children. Stop sniffing the kids. They're not your children, all right? That's not how this works. God gave those children to us. They are God's children. We've been entrusted with the responsibility for raising them in the fear and the discipline and the nurture of the Lord. They are not Joe Biden's children, okay? But this is what they want you to believe. And I want to share with you, just before we get into the details of how they're doing this, that they do have an end goal. They have an objective in mind, and you can prove very easily that this is the objective that they're working for. Some of you probably remember this. This was 1991, national television. George H.W. Bush told us that we were going to have a New World Order. And as part of this New World Order, we're going to have the rule of law governing the conduct of nations. We're going to have the UN's peacekeeping troops implementing the vision of the UN's founders. President of the United States. Oopsies.
Look.
Oh, well, it looks like it's not working, but I think a lot of you guys remember that talk. And if you know anything about the UN's founders, that should creep you out too. On the one side of the table, you had Joseph Stalin's minion, foreign minister of the Soviet Union. These were some of the worst mass-murdering barbarians to have ever walked on the planet. They massacred tens of millions of people. This was after World War II. Then we sent our guys. The leader of our team was Alger Hiss. And some of you know Alger Hiss. Most of you probably don't. He purported to represent the United States. They liked him so much they made him the chairman of the conference that wrote the UN Charter. Then they made him the first Secretary General of the United Nations, and then we threw him in prison. We found out he was a spy for Joseph Stalin. So that's the vision of the UN's founders, and he's talking about implementing it at the barrel of a UN peacekeeper gun. And he's not alone.
President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
Yeah, so they're all working on this. Here's Joe Biden.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
Right, and we can watch New World Order videos all day. I mean, every world leader that you can think of probably is on record supporting the New World Order. But that's what they're preparing our children for right now. And if you really want to understand it, if you really want to get to the essence of what they're doing, just take everything the Bible teaches, flip it exactly upside down, and that's where they'll come down on every issue every time. They may not come out of the closet at first because it might be a little controversial, but that's the direction they're moving, again, on every issue every time. God said, "Thou shalt not steal." They said, well, resources aren't equitably distributed, so we're going to have to redistribute them, which is another way of saying we're going to have to rob you, steal all your stuff, and then we'll hand it out the way we think is appropriate. God says, "Thou shalt not murder." Well, unborn babies, I mean, that's not really murder, right? It's just a clump of cells. Older people, well, they're costing a lot on healthcare costs. And so that's the direction they're moving in, again, on every issue, every time. And they tell you that the public schools are the primary mechanism they're going to be using for this transformation. That's not my opinion. That's what they themselves put in their own international agreements and documents. Anybody heard of Agenda 21? It's the agenda for the 21st century. Every UN member state, with the exception of the Vatican, because it doesn't really have a population to rule over, has signed on to UN Agenda 21. It's like their 100-year plan. And for those of you who watch too much CNN, you might have heard it's a conspiracy theory. Here's George Bush. Wait, why are our Bush videos not working? Okay, well, we don't have our Bush videos, but he's the one who signed it on behalf of the United States. He said that Agenda 21 is this important document. It's going to help us make the planet more sustainable. The leader of the Communist Party in Congress also likes it.
An opportunity to follow up on the important work of the Earth Summit to develop its blueprint, Agenda 21, for global environmental action. HCON Res 353 outlines a comprehensive national strategy for sustainable development in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21 to be coordinated under the leadership of a specific office and at the direction of a...
All right, so the bipartisan uniparty machine loves Agenda 21. If you go to for those of you who aren't familiar with it, here's the UN's summary of Agenda 21. It's intended to be implemented by every person on Earth. That's interesting. And it's going to require, they say, a profound reorientation of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. These are big changes they're talking about. Our government committed us to this transformation without ever asking. Did any of you guys vote on this? This profound reorientation of all human society? No, I didn't vote on it either. In fact, they didn't even ask the Senate to ratify it. They just said it's a done deal. And in Chapter 36, they tell you how they're going to get there. They're not going to ask you to vote on it. We're the bitter clingers, as Obama famously called, clinging to our guns and our Bibles. Right? They know that. So how are they going to get it done? Well, in Chapter 36, they have the primary mechanism for making this happen, education. It's critical for promoting sustainable development, they say in Chapter 36. It's indispensable to changing people's attitudes. They say it's critical for achieving environmental ethical awareness, the right values, attitudes, behaviors that are going to be consistent with this ideology from hell. And also, it needs to be integrated into all disciplines, and it needs to include spiritual development. Remember that. We'll come back to the spiritual development part because they don't mean what a Christian thinks they mean. So here's the Agenda 21 book for children. I have a copy in my office. It's insane. You should read it. It's an atrocity. This is one page that jumped out at me. You see the Hindu deities are up there, and they're very sad. They're very upset because these storks are delivering all these babies. Oh, man, babies, more babies. On the next page, you read what the problem is. Turns out the earth groans every time it registers another birth. Yeah. Remember what I said about God and His Word? And what did God say? Literally, His very first command to mankind was what? Be fruitful and multiply. Okay, He says children are a blessing. Children are your heritage. Well, the UN says Mother Earth is groaning every time another one of those little environmental disasters is born. Okay, that's what they're teaching our kids. This is a UN book being used in schools all around the world. This is UNESCO, the UN Education Agency, and they're bragging about how important education will be to this.
Achieve sustainable development that protects our planet and builds a more inclusive, equal, and peaceful world without education. We can't. Sustainable development begins with education. Put global education first.
All right, so two things. Sustainable development begins with education, and you got to have global education first. Again, we'll keep coming back to these. But I want to give you some examples. There are hundreds of these we could choose from, but they have now mastered this process of attitude changing that they were describing in these global agreements. Some of you probably remember back to the early 1990s. If I had told you we'd soon be having homosexual marriages, you would have laughed at me. You might have even called out the guys with the white lab coats to put me in a padded room. Sodomy laws were still in place across most of the country. The Supreme Court didn't strike down sodomy laws until 2001. So the idea of a homosexual marriage was not on anybody's radar, except the people running your public schools. They had this documentary. It's called It's Elementary, talking about gay issues at school. Some of the folks in the audience may have actually seen this in school if you were in school in the 90s. They showed it in classrooms all across the United States of America. And listen carefully to what they're teaching these children. Oh, no, we don't have the video on this. All right. Well, it's an excerpt from the documentary. And you see this teacher, he's got a classroom full of kids, and he says to them, hey, so let's be pretend judges, right? We're going to be pretend judges, and we're going to consider this issue of gay marriage. You know, there are some people who say that gays shouldn't be allowed to get married even if they love each other because they don't think that's what a family is. And then there are other people who think that's not really the business of the government. Free people should just be allowed to marry whoever they love. And then they go to the kids, and all the kids say, oh, yeah, we should knock down those mean, terrible laws. Now, what if they had told the kids the truth? What if they had told the kids what God says about marriage? That it's a representation of the relationship between Christ and the church, that it produces children that parents are then entrusted with to raise and educate and discipline in the fear and instruction of the Lord, that's how faith and culture gets passed on from one generation to the next. Maybe the kids wouldn't have come to that conclusion. But what happened? In less than one generation, the pretend judges on our Supreme Court struck down marriage laws in all 50 states. How'd they get that done? Well, they brainwashed one generation. That's all they needed. Now, they couldn't get this on the ballot even in California, the land of fruits and nuts. Voters said, no, we're good, thank you. And yet, by preparing one generation to believe that the pretend judges could strike down our marriage laws, that's all they needed. So they're very effective at this. Then we had gay marriage. Now we're here. They call this the Drag Queen Story Hour. They do this all over the United States in public schools. Obviously, that's a guy wearing a dress and some demon horns, so you'd know where it came from, right? Straight from the pit of hell. This lady here, Shirley McCoon. Long before anybody ever heard of Common Core, long before anybody ever imagined that we'd have a national education system, George H.W. Bush hired this lady, Dr. Shirley McCoon, to start developing national standards for our schools. So she went to the U.S. Department of Education and started working on the plan to bring about a national education system in this country. She's a very interesting lady. She claims to be communicating with spiritual entities she calls ascended masters. We'll come back to that theme as well, but let's see if we can hear her.
Fix up these schools and taking
Here she is. Here, let me go back a little bit. The context here. So after she was hired by George H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush put on an education conference, and all 50 state governors came there to hear this. And so they're sitting in the audience, and they end up clapping like trained seals when she's done. But listen to what she has to say.
Fix up these schools and taking care of them, rather than the issue of understanding that what we're into is a total restructuring of the society. What is happening in America?
A total restructuring of our society. And now watch, the schools are the way it's going to be restructured.
The other function of schools, which sounds paradoxical and yet in a sense is really not, is the fact that we have to prepare students not for today's society, but for a society that's 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. And so we have to anticipate what the future is.
They use their crystal ball for that, right?
And figure out what it is we need to do today. That's called anticipatory socialization, or the social change function of school.
Anticipatory socialization, a social change function of schools? How many parents do you think know there's a social change function of schools when they put their kids on the school bus? My guess is probably not many, right? But that's what they're doing. They're bringing about social change through the schools, and they're very, very open about it. Again, I mentioned she talks to ascended masters. They revealed to her this secret knowledge that we're heading into a wonderful new age as soon as we get rid of all those dang Christians. Okay, so what does this social change function look like? Well, they're getting pretty bold. In Minnesota a few years ago, a little boy was brainwashed at school to believe he was actually a girl. Mom, can I have a sex change, please? No, son, that's silly. Get on the school bus, please. Well, the other equal partner in this relationship, the government, determined that they knew better than the other partner, the mom, and so they actually took this boy to be castrated. Yeah, he had his genitals removed as part of what they now call gender-affirming care, and the mom sued in federal court, and guess what? Turns out that is not a violation of the mom's parental rights, according to the federal courts. So that could happen to anyone. Now, this was in California. It's called a gender transition plan. I pulled it off the Department of Education website. They were using this all over the state, and the kids are supposed to fill out, what gender do you identify as? What are your pronouns? Your parents know, because if not, don't worry, we will hide this from them, no problem. Are you getting the affirming care that you need? Because if not, don't worry, we'll get you your puberty blockers or your testosterone injections, whatever it is, so we can prepare you for mutilation. And there's bad enough in California, the land of fruits and nuts. I actually just flew in from California Monday morning, so I just came out of the fire there. But it was interesting. I was giving a talk similar to this in Flagler County, not too far from here, actually, and some of the members of the school board were there, and one of the nice ladies after on the school board came up, and she said, Alex, that same document you were talking about, we have that here in Flagler County. Flagler County. It's more Republican than Brevard County. in Florida, supposedly the bastion of freedom and conservatism and common sense. Turns out this document is being used all over the country, not just in Flagler County and California. It is everywhere. They're doing drag shows in schools. I won't show you that because it's horrific. The NEA, the teachers' union, over 3 million members. They partnered with a radical anti-Christian hate group called Human Rights Campaign, and they sent this to all their members. This is how you make an inclusive school. Watch. I got this from several teachers who are members of the NEA.
Hi, your name is Emma?
Yes.
Correct? And my name is Zim. What pronouns do you use?
I use she, they, them.
Cool, cool,
What
cool.
pronouns do you use?
I use they, them, and also just Z. And so instead of being a boy or girl or something undefined or in the middle, I kind of like, just use my name. You know, my name is Zim, so if you just use Z instead of a pronoun, it's like more personalized and like less fitting into a binary.
Yeah, okay. So for future reference, my pronouns, Generalissimo and Your Highness. Thank you. And you guys know misgendering is a crime now, so watch out, all right? And folks, this stuff is working really well, right? It's really, really effective at its intended purpose. In California, in 2017, the UCLA did a survey. They found that 27% of California's teenagers were now gender nonconforming. So these are boys who don't accept that they're boys, girls who don't accept that they're girls. Now, I grew up in the 1990s. I lived in 8 countries on 4 continents. I grew up with every kind of kid you could ever imagine, every religion, every ethnicity, every everything. I never, in my whole childhood, found a boy who didn't understand he was a boy, or a girl who didn't understand she was a girl. It was unheard of. The word transgender wasn't even in the dictionary. And yet, 5 years ago in California, over 1 in 4 children now don't know whether they're boys or girls or something in between. It's working very well. And, you know, when I go to conservative states, I get a lot of pushback. Well, that's California. You know, that doesn't apply to us, right? We're in Utah. So I was in Utah. I was invited to the state capitol to meet with some of their officials. I met with a few of the state school board members. Like, Alex, you have to see this. This is the data from the Controlled Substance Database. They're keeping track of what doctors are prescribing, you know, make sure somebody doesn't prescribe too many pain pills or whatever. And what they found was that there has been a 10,000% increase in a 5-year period in the number of underage girls going through gender transition, what they call gender transitions. Of course, God made your chromosomes. You're either a boy or a girl, period. But a 10,000% increase in 5 years in one of the most conservative states in America. Supermajorities of Republicans in both houses of the legislature. No Democrats in statewide office in the entire state. And a 10,000% increase. So there's only a few options to explain this. Are they putting something in the water? I don't think so. Are they brainwashing your kids in school? That's exactly what they're doing, folks. And then Disney comes in as air support, you know, to reinforce the lies they're learning in school. Here's a survey. Less than 50% of teens today identify as straight. Less than half of American teenagers, according to this survey, are straight. Okay, and if you thought this was the last stop on the crazy train, we're just getting started. We won't go too deep into this. You know, the Bible says it's shameful to even talk of some of these things, but you need to know where this is going. So in California in 2016, they passed a mandatory LGBT law. All the kids had to be exposed to LGBT brainwashing. And I got a hold of some of the curricula they were using. They're monstrous. You know, they start with Harvey Milk, the pervert who raped a bunch of kids, some of whom killed themselves. They don't mention that part in the curriculum. And then they get to ancient Greece, and they just kind of casually throw it out there for the kids. Oh, yeah, men had relationships with boys, and no big deal. It's just a history of LGBT. So this mom who sent me this video was like, what? You're teaching my kids what? So she goes and she confronts the assistant superintendent of curricula. You're going to see her in a moment, Carrie Torres, and listen to this conversation.
Answer me why you're teaching pedophilia in school to ninth graders. Teaching what? Pedophilia, pederasty, right here.
Pederasty, as I discussed with you before, twice in my office when you come to view the materials, I've explained to you that this is done because we are talking about historical perspectives of how gender relations and different types of sexual orientations have existed in history. So this is something,
a man and a boy is a sexual orientation.
something that's occurred in history, and so this is really important for us to include.
It's just a different sexual orientation. Raping children is just a different sexual orientation, guys. And in case you didn't know, it's now against the law to discriminate against someone based on their sexual orientation all across the United States, thanks to the pretend judges on the Supreme Court. So, you know, we all recognize it would be totally insane to put a pedophile in the kindergarten classroom. But what happens when the next generation grows up? Well, you can't discriminate against minor attracted persons. It's coming, folks. It's coming. This is ubiquitous now, unfortunately. The UN has global sex ed standards that they recommend for every school in the world. They want to teach 5-year-olds things that I cannot say in this room because they're so horrific and so perverted. And it all goes back to this monster here, Alfred Kinsey. Some of you may have heard of him. Again, it's shameful to speak of these things, so I won't get into details, but him and his buddies molested hundreds of children. They kept meticulous notes on what they were doing. You can find it in his own published books, Sexuality and the Human Male, published in 1948. They kept meticulous records of what they were doing, and long story short, they said, the kids love this. They're sexual from birth. We need to start teaching them sex ed the moment we can pry them loose from their parents. Folks, this is straight from the pit of hell, okay? And this is the underpinning, the pseudoscientific underpinning of all the sex madness that's happening in our schools today. It has no basis in science. It is all the work of one disgusting pervert and his buddies. So let's get to the idea of education. Right? There's this myth out there that our children are still learning something useful in school. Even if you set aside all the crazy propaganda, at least they're going to learn how to read, write, and do math. Right? No. They're not, and that's not my opinion. So the same people who brought you Common Core, which is a total atrocity, also brought you the next generation science standards. This is being used almost all across America. There's a handful of states that have so far resisted. 12 years of pseudoscience education later, if your school follows the standards, which most schools in America do today, your child will have never even heard the term scientific method. How in the world can you do 12 years of science and never hear the term scientific method? It's obviously preposterous. What they will learn is that there are infinite genders. The planet is going to be ruined if we don't pay taxes to the UN for our CO2 emissions, literally the gas you exhale. Somehow if you pay enough taxes to the UN, they're going to make the temperature perfect, is what they're teaching our kids. And then they learn that they came from slime that turned into a monkey over billions of years and there is no God. No actual science, lots and lots of pseudoscientific propaganda. The history that they're learning is just as phony and just as fake. Somehow America went from being the first country in the world founded on the self-evident truth that God created us, that He made us equal, that He gave us unalienable rights. This is what, of course, set in motion the train that eventually ended slavery, not just here but around the world. Right? American states were the first jurisdictions in the world to criminalize slavery. Then William Wilberforce over in the UK got the idea. They pushed it through over there. Then we finally got it done here. It took a long time for this to catch on globally. I mean, in 2007, you could still buy and sell slaves legally in Mauritania, an African country. The Saudi Arabians didn't ban slavery until the 60s. Right? So it took a long time for the rest of the world to catch up to us, and yet it was our founding fathers who set this in motion by saying God created us equally. God gave us rights. And somehow, the script is exactly flipped in our schools today. Our kids learn that America is this uniquely horrible and evil place. We practically invented slavery. Right? Your average young person today thinks America invented slavery. They believe we're uniquely evil. And so that translates into what you see today. Let's burn down the country. Let's open up the borders. Let's smash all of our institutions. Why are they doing this? Because they're learning fake history in the classroom. Now, the idea of reading, writing, and math, right? That's the last justification people still have. You don't have to take my opinion on this. The federal government, every 2 years, they do a survey. It's called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They have found that less than 1/3 of the victims of government schools are proficient in anything: reading, writing, math, science, history, anything. And by proficient, I don't mean they're good at it. I don't mean they've mastered it. I mean they're barely eking over the most dumbed-down standards in all of our history. It's pathetic. Well, here's the Deputy Secretary of Education.
The National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP, which is called America's Report Card, reports that 2/3, get this, 2/3 of American 8th graders are not proficient in any core subject.
All right, imagine this in any other industry. Like imagine a fast food restaurant where less than 1/3 of the people who ordered a cheeseburger actually got one. Most of them got dead rat on a piece of decomposing bread. Would we accept that? And what if then they had the nerve to say, well, just give us more money, then we'll get you a cheeseburger? Right, can you imagine? And yet that's exactly what the public school system is doing right now. Less than 1/3 of our kids know anything. Right? My wife and I taught our kids to read in a matter of a few months with a free resource we printed off from the internet. It's not hard to teach a child how to read. And yet these government indoctrination centers have our kids for 12 years at a cost of about $20,000 per year, and we've got millions of kids graduating who literally cannot read their high school diploma. Is not an accident, and it should not be tolerated for one moment. This is a fraud of monumental proportions. If a restaurant did this, the SWAT team would kick in the door before morning. When the public schools do it, they say, give us more money. We want your kids 24/7. We need them for 15 hours a day. We need more homework. No, that's not what they need. Okay, this is a deliberate plan. They did it on purpose. So here's what they're teaching. They're going to mosques. They're learning the 5 pillars of Islam. They're doing Buddhism in the classroom, Hinduism in the classroom. They're summoning spirits. This is a Black Lives Matter teacher training program at Howard University to teach teachers how to teach kids to summon demons.
And I'm going to ask you to hold an ancestor. Hold an ancestor in your head right now. So, ancestors watching, I know they're watching. Ancestors watching, I know. Now call out your ancestors into the room.
All right, so we can summon demons, but don't you dare mention the 10 Commandments. Don't you dare teach the children the Lord's Prayer. Don't even talk about a Bible. If you mention Jesus, you're in big trouble, right? But, summoning spirits? Oh, let's do that all day, right? So in North Carolina, they actually got caught forcing the Christian kids to come up and stand in the front of the classroom and apologize for their Christian privilege, which is actually what Chairman Mao used to do. He divided society into the black class and the red class. Black class was the landowners, business owners, etc. Red classes were the peasants, the workers, etc. And this is what they did to the black kids. They made them stand in front of the class and apologize for their black privilege because maybe their dad and mom had a farm or something. So they would go, I'm sorry for my black privilege. I wish I could scrub it off, but I can't. This is what they're doing to the Christian kids now. And they do it, they have intersectioning identities and stuff. And so they make the kids who have European ancestors apologize for their white privilege. It's actually one of the ways they get the little girls, right? They tell the little girls with light skin, you have white privilege. Did you know that? Did you know that every bad thing that ever happened in the world is because you're privileged? You're responsible. And little girls say, oh, no, not me. I didn't do it. I don't want to. Well, with this intersection identity thing, if you picked a letter from the alphabet, you got L's and G's and B's, and you could be a T, then suddenly you would magically transform into a victim. And then you wouldn't have to be one of those mean oppressors. You could join the victim category, the oppressed category. And so the little girls say, oh, okay, I'll be a transgender. I don't know what that means, but sign me up. So this is what they're doing to our kids, folks. In California, State Board of Education unanimously voted to approve an ethnic studies model curriculum. It was mandatory, requiring elementary school children to chant praises to the demonic pagan Aztec deities of cannibalism, war, and human sacrifice. I grew up surrounded by this. So I grew up in Mexico City. I spent 7 years there. The pyramids were not far from my house. And anybody could go there and say, oh, yeah, they sacrificed 80,000 people on top of this pyramid one weekend to the very same gods that these children in California were required to sing praises to. Now, they finally stopped a few months ago because the federal court was about to spank them. But this is the mindset of the people who are running the public school system. They're gathering massive amounts of data on your kids to make sure they believe the lies. Right here you see a facial expression camera. I pulled this right out of a U.S. Department of Education report. It's a 2012 report. And it says it captures the facial expressions of students, feeds that data through an algorithm, determines what kind of reaction they had, and determines whether they have the right attitude to the issue being presented. So maybe it's open borders, maybe it's abortion, maybe it's homosexual marriage, whatever it is. They put the image on the screen, and maybe your kid goes, ugh, what is that? Oh, the system will determine your child needs an intervention. Okay? And then what do they do with the data? According to that same report, they're going to make predictions about the future behaviors and performance of your children. It's getting weird, huh? Now, one of the things that they do to make the kids abandon their values that their parents and the Bible and their pastor tried to instill in them, it's a very nefarious trick. They've been using this in the United States since the 1960s. They started in 66. And I remember when they did it to me. I was living in Brazil at the time. They did it to me at an international school. I remember it like it was yesterday. So here's what they said. Y'all are on a ship, and your ship is sailing on the sea, and suddenly you're sinking, and you got to jump into the life raft. And 11 of you jumped in, but your life raft has a carrying capacity of 10. So you've got a doctor, a nurse, a teacher, a lawyer, an engineer, and an Indian chief. Who are you going to murder so that the rest of the group can survive? And so the kids are thinking about this, and we all know the answer, right? Well, obviously you get rid of the lawyer. Totally kidding, but really, what do we need lawyers for? No, there's good lawyers. I'm just messing around. But now, if the kids were really thinking, they'd say, well, wait a minute here. Mom and Dad said not to kill people. Pastor said that. Bible said that. I'll just volunteer. I'll swim alongside the raft for the first few hours, and when I get too tired, maybe we can rotate, and then we don't have to murder anybody. How about that? No, that's not how the exercise is supposed to work. They're supposed to come to the conclusion that Mom and Dad and the pastor and the Bible are ridiculous. They never thought about this scenario. Clearly, ethics are relative. Morality depends on the situation. If it's for the greater good to murder somebody, well, then murdering somebody becomes good. This is ridiculous. And yet, it shatters a child's worldview. They brag that in 15 minutes they can undo everything that parents tried to instill in their children in 15 years. And they're right. What do mom and dad know? What does the pastor know? How could they have never thought about this? They must be so dumb. I'm so much smarter than them. So you get these kids, they think they know much more than their parents. It's because of this kind of stuff. It's very deliberate. And a little fun fact, I actually just learned this yesterday, the day before yesterday. The guy who invented this exercise killed himself. And yet the UN says every child on planet Earth needs to be subjected to these kinds of exercises that they call values clarification. Now, we have gone a long way down. In 1983, Ronald Reagan put together a commission. They said that our very nation and people are at risk as a result of this so-called education. They said if a foreign power had done it, we would have viewed it as an act of war, and I think we should. And to understand how bad it's gotten, you have to understand where we came from, right? America was the most educated, the most literate society that had ever existed in all of human history, long before we ever heard of a public school. Okay? John Adams wrote in a letter to a friend that a native of America who can't read or write is as rare as a comet or an earthquake. Yeah, you might find one way out in the, the hills or something, but very rare, right? Read the Federalist Papers. These were written for average, everyday Americans, farmers, shoemakers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths. These were not for the intellectual elite. Go try to find some young people today who can understand this. They can't understand it, even in modern English. Right? There was a lot of literacy surveys done. People were curious, how literate are we as a society? Virtually every one showed that we had almost universal literacy, especially in all the big cities. If you exclude the slave population in the South, we had almost universal literacy in this country for generations. For generations. This was published in 1812. Less than 4 in 1,000 young Americans are unable to write legibly, even neatly. Today it's just the opposite, right? 4 in 1,000, if they could write legibly, that's impressive. It used to be the schools in the hands of the churches and homeschooling, right? Virtually every church denomination had its own school system. They allowed children who couldn't pay to come for free. And then along comes this guy, Robert Owen. Here's the history of the public school system in a nutshell. This guy comes along. He's a communist before Karl Marx comes along, and he sets up a communist commune in Indiana called New Harmony to show how great communism was going to be. Obviously, he rejects God. He rejects biblical morality. He says we have to dismantle the family, and we need to stop with this private property. We need a collectivist utopia. So obviously the colony failed. In less than 2 years, it completely failed because obviously when you ignore God's commands on family and property, things don't go well. But so he wrote these essays, very bizarre essays, saying that really government should start educating children. He believed the reason his colony failed was because these children had been educated by parents who had been brought up in a Christian society that had a lot of emphasis on the individual, and he thought that was the problem. So he said government ought to educate children. And he wrote these essays. Well, the Prussian ambassador took his essays back to the dictator of Prussia, and he was still smarting from a loss in a war to Napoleon. Thought, hey, that'll be good. Let's implement that here. According to Robert Owen's autobiography, the Prussian dictator so much approved of these ideas from Robert Owen that he ordered his government to create the first ever system of education of the state, by the state, and for the state. Okay? And he also set up a secret society, very interesting. We know of it because a guy became a Catholic and repented of this evil and blew the whistle. His name was Orestes Brownson. And he said they were trying to do 2 immediate things: change public opinion, get men elected to the legislatures who would support government education. But he said the great object, he wrote a whole book on this, the great object was to get rid of Christianity. That's why he wanted the government to educate your children, to get rid of Christianity. That was the purpose of this idea from the very start. Now, by nature, secret societies are hard to track. It's hard to track their influence. But what we do know is that this guy right here, Horace Mann, got himself selected by legislators in Massachusetts as the first ever Secretary of Education. No state had ever had a Secretary of Education or a government school system. So this guy, Horace Mann, loves the Prussian system inspired by Robert Owen. He tries to import it to Massachusetts. Right away, the quackery comes flooding in. He wants to get the Bible out of the classroom, which was at the time was, ludicrous. That's the primary textbook used for every child in every school in this country. Of course, we're not going to get rid of the Bible. He wants to equalize all men. And when he's done doing damage in Massachusetts, he travels the country like an evangelist, preaching the good news of salvation by government schools. So, like I mentioned, right away, the quackery comes pouring in. They pioneer this new method of teaching reading called the whole word method of teaching reading. It is debunked in less than a year. The schoolmasters in Boston say, look, this is silly. We're not going to be doing this. This is not how children learn how to read. And we don't hear about that method again for 50 years until John Dewey comes on the scene. Now, John Dewey is almost universally recognized as the founding father of the public school system in America today. I think in fairness, we need to assign some of the blame to Robert Owen and Horace Mann. But he's a very religious man. He loves the Soviet Union. He thinks the Soviet model is excellent. He just wants to get there without violent revolution. He wants to brainwash the kids to get there. If you want to see how much he loved the Soviet Union, read his articles in New Republic talking about how great it was. And so he outlines this plan to dumb down the children. It's such an important essay. We reprinted it in the back of a book I wrote with Dr. Sam Blumenfeld. We have a few copies if you're interested. And I say the change must come gradually. To force it unduly is going to compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. Okay? And so I want to talk about his religion for just a moment, because him and his buddies thought they were inventing a new religion. They created the Humanist Manifesto. 30-something of these intellectuals got together. And the very first tenet, this is quoted directly from the document, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. Well, what does the Bible say? In the beginning, God created. So their very first plank is a direct attack on the very first words in the Word of God. Now, even if you're not a Bible-believing Christian, and you should be, eternity depends on it, talk to me later, this has very important political implications as well. Our founding fathers didn't think you had to study your Bible to recognize that we are created by a creator, right, who gave us rights. Well, what happens if you believe John Dewey's religion? You can't have God-given rights. There's no God. Don't be silly, right? So his little buddy, C.F. Potter, one of the signatories on this thing, he wrote a book, Humanism, a New Religion. He said public schools are going to be the biggest ally of humanism. What's your Sunday school teaching some of the kids 1 hour a week going to do against 5 days of humanistic teachings in the schools? Now, if you think about this new religion, the idea that man is his own little God because there's no real God, we can decide for ourselves what's right and wrong, it's actually not a new religion. It's the oldest lie in the book, right? Genesis chapter 3, ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil, right? It's literally Satan's lie in the garden. Satan is so uncreative. And yet, this was institutionalized and established as the national religion of the United States. 1962, the Supreme Court said we couldn't have prayer in the schools. 63, no more Bibles. The justice who wrote the dissent here, Justice Potter Stewart, you should read the whole dissent. It's brilliant. What he said is this refusal to permit religious exercises is not the realization of state neutrality. Rather, this is the establishment of a religion of secularism or humanism. So under the guise of enforcing the First Amendment, which says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, New York and Pennsylvania are not Congress, by the way, in case I have to remind you, the Supreme Court established a national religion from the pit of hell. They forced us to pay for its propagation with our taxes, and they forced us to hand our children over to be indoctrinated with this false religion. And now we're reaping the fruit, right? Kids are killing themselves. Kids are killing each other. We've got drug abuse out of control. Our society is collapsing. Our families are collapsing. What did we think was going to happen when we educated several generations of Americans into a false, evil religion? Now, don't get me wrong. It's a free country. John Dewey and his buddies, they could believe any stupid thing they want. They could believe any false religion they want. It's not my place to use the government to force them to believe the truth. But what they can't do is take my tax money and brainwash my children into a false religion. But that's exactly what they did. Now, they're moving rapidly toward a one-world system of so-called education. The UNESCO is very open about this. They've said in their education agreements, all children need to learn from the same standards of learning. We've got to change their attitudes, values, and behaviors. Here's the Secretary General of the UN in 2015.
Education must do more than produce individuals who can read, write, and count. It must nurture global citizens who can rise to the challenges of the 21st century.
So forget reading, writing, and math. It's about making global citizens, right? They want to shape the spirituality of your children. They brag about this, right? Here's the Secretary of Education.
Hi, I'm Arnie Duncan, U.S. Secretary of Education, and we are so honored that the UN Secretary General has designated the United States as a champion country of the UN Global Education First Initiative.
All right, so we're not just participating, we're a champion country of this, right? Now, the UN has what they call a World Core Curriculum. It was written by this guy here, Robert Mueller, Assistant Secretary General of the UN. And there's a bombshell in the teacher's manual. You could probably get it at your local library. It says the teaching, the underlying philosophy, is based on the books of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Juval Kuhl. And that means nothing to most of you, I know. I'll give you a hint about the significance. Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. True story. It's today called the Lucius Trust because Lucifer Publishing was just a little too obvious. And this Tibetan teacher that he mentions is not Tibetan or a teacher. In fact, he's an ascended master. Alice Bailey claimed to be communicating with spiritual entities who were revealing secret truths to her. And in the book, Education in the New Age, by Alice Bailey and her demons, they said that world citizenship needs to be the goal of the enlightened, with a world federation and a world brain. We're going to get there by fusing Marxism and neo-scholasticism using the methods of John Dewey. Full circle. Okay. Now, Bill Gates of hell, he loved this idea. He went over to UNESCO headquarters in 2004, signed an agreement with them. They said they're going to create global education standards, global curricula, global teacher training programs, and global technology to make it all work. Then he comes back to America, starts putting millions and then billions of dollars into this atrocity we call Common Core. Now, it's not my opinion that this is what's happening. Here's an advertisement that they bought to tell you how great Common Core was. Listen. Oh, we don't have it? Okay. Well, anyways, what the ad says is that Common Core is great. It's going to line up America's education system with international standards. So kids in Shanghai and Paris, Seattle and Chicago will all be learning from the same standards. Okay? And I've got the ad. I can send you all these videos that didn't work. And so now we've reached pretty much the end. I'm just going to share with you a couple minutes about what I think we ought to do about this, which you could just throw right in the trash, and then much more importantly, what God says about education. And I think this is what we really need to be paying attention to. So the first question, it's obvious, like, how do we reform the system? And for me, that's like, how do we reform your cancer? I'm not actually interested in reforming my cancer. I'd like to get rid of my cancer, thank you. I don't want to be misunderstood here. Sometimes I get public school teachers who get offended when I say that. Like, there's lots of great public school teachers. There's lots of Christians in the public school system. When I say we need to abolish the system as it exists, I don't mean we don't need teachers. I don't mean we don't need schools. Any more than if I said the collective agricultural system in the Soviet Union is terrible is not an attack on farmers or farms, right? We need farmers. We need farms. We just don't need government-run farms. We also don't need government-run indoctrination centers teaching false religion to our children and producing illiterates and people who can't do math, right? So as I see it, we have two options here. We either get our children, and I'm talking about the church here, we either get our children out of this monstrous system as quickly as we possibly can, or we prepare to lose it all. We prepare to live under that New World order that these maniacs were talking to. They were talking about, these presidents. Something like 80 to 90% of Christian children who spend 12 years in a government school system will leave the church and they will leave the faith. We've got a massive crisis going on here, folks. And when people say, we don't talk about education in this church, we're just about the Great Commission. Do you hear yourself? You're going to make disciples of all nations. You're going to send a missionary to Haiti, but you're going to lose 80 to 90% of the children in your congregation. Tell me again how you're going to make disciples of all nations when you're losing 80 to 90% of the disciples you should be making in your church? That's not how it works, folks. Our ministry begins in our home. Right? And yes, we need to send missionaries overseas. I'm all about that. I love that idea. I hope some of my kids will grow up to be missionaries. But we can't lose the vast majority of our children and still pretend like we're being faithful to the Great Commission. It's silliness, right? And by the way, the end of the Great Commission, right? Teach them to obey, teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. Yeah, that applies to education and the raising of our children as well. So I tell families, like, the building's on fire, your children are inside, you hear them screaming, you see the pain that they're in. What do? Well, you sign a petition, of course. You run for school board. No, right? And I'm not against those things. I think those things are important. I think we should do those things. But if your children are in the burning building, you would never dream of signing a petition or running for school board. You run into the building, and as fast as your legs will carry you, you run out and you take your child to safety, and you wake the town so that they can get their children to safety. Right? There's a time for running for school board and for petitions, and that time is after you have gotten your children to safety. So, I believe churches, pastors need to be part of this, right? The Bible says, preach the whole counsel of God. Guess what? God has a lot to say about education. First, he says in Proverbs 22:6, Caesar should be training up the children in the way that they should go, and some of you are giving me funny looks, as you should. This is not addressed to Caesar, right? This is addressed to us. Okay, you should train up your children in the way they should go. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and also Deuteronomy chapter 11 give us very clear instructions for what an education for our children looks like. It says you should be teaching your children about God when you wake up in the morning, when you lie down at night, when you're walking by the way, when you rise up, when you're eating, all the time. You need to be teaching your children about God. Ephesians chapter 6, right? Not Caesar, but parents. You should bring your children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, God doesn't tell us how many credit hours of science or math might be appropriate for a well-rounded education, but he gives us the basics. He says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Okay? That's what God says in Proverbs 1:7, Proverbs 9:10. And then my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. That's what happens with no knowledge. How much fear of the Lord are they getting in public schools? None. Zero. Zip. Nada. They're mocking the Lord to the extent that they mention him at all. You think your kids are going to get any wisdom or knowledge there? I mean, if you believe the Bible, self-evidently, that's ridiculous, right? Now, Jesus tells us to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. If your children belong to Caesar, by all means, stick them back on that bus. See what happens. If your children belong to God, you better pray about this. This is serious because we are going to be responsible. We are going to answer to God one day for how we fulfilled this. And again, whoever's not with me is against me. Anybody want to come up here and make an argument that the schools are with Christ? We all know it's silly, right? I ask that every time I talk about this. No one ever comes up. The pagans, the Satanists, they all know the schools are not with Christ. It's just Christians, apparently, who don't, right? How many atheists send their kids to Christian schools? Not many. How many Christians send their kids to humanist schools? A whole lot, okay? Martin Luther said any school that's not diligently teaching the Scriptures is going to be the great gates of hell. Harvard was a legitimate educational institution at one time, believe it or not. It said every student should be plainly instructed, earnestly pressed to consider well that the main end of his life and studies is to get a good job, make a lot of money, and buy a fancy car. No, it's to know God and Jesus Christ, right? That's the purpose of education. So I believe homeschooling is the gold standard. I recognize not everybody is called to homeschool, so I believe Christian schools play a very important role. We as parents have the authority to delegate some of that to others. Homeschoolers are running circles around the victims of government schools. We've got some resources if you want to help get the word out, some very cost-effective magazines, some DVDs. I serve on the board of the Freedom Project Academy. I'm not here as an ad for the school. It's a great online classical Christian school. We have a ministry called Public School Exit. I'm the executive director, which sounds fancy. I'm just a volunteer. But we do have a paid staff in California, and we will help any church or any family, anywhere, whatever it takes, get the kids out of public school. If we have to put up money, we'll put up money. If we have to fly out a team of experts to help the church stand up something, we'll do it. Whatever it takes, we will do it. We need an exodus from the schools, and I want to just leave you with a couple of scriptures, right? This is not a new problem that we're facing. Evildoers in power conspiring against God has been going on for thousands of years. In Psalm 2, verse 2, David talks about the kings of the earth take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed one. Some versions say they conspire together against the Lord. And you can imagine God's probably just terrified, right? Oh no, the kings of the earth, oh, what do I do, right? God laughs at them, right? God ridicules them. And so I think we can laugh a little bit too. And we also know that this is not an educational battle or even a political battle. Folks, those are important things, right? We need to be involved in all areas as Christians. We are the salt and the light. If we retreat, who's going to take over? Well, the enemy, of course. But this is ultimately a spiritual battle. And the Bible says it this way: we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, and against spiritual wickedness in high places. So the Bible is our weapon. We can turn this around, but it begins with Christians being faithful to what God has called us to do, and that is bring up our children in the fear, discipline, admonition, and nurture of the Lord. We've got to abandon this pagan system before it destroys our children, our families, and our country. God bless you guys, and thank you very much.
We want to give a few minutes if folks have a few questions, and we'll just pass the mic around. We are recording, so if you would ask your question in the mic.
You had a question? Do you have a question?
Can you repeat that 1-800 number that I saw on the screen?
Oh, let's see. Yeah, you can order more copies there. We do have a few copies here. If you don't have money, you could just take one. We just ask for money so we can order more. But right there, if you want to order copies of the magazine, we have them in English and Spanish. If you know folks who don't speak English as their first language, you can talk to my son, the boy running there in the back. He can help you out when we're done. But yeah, these are just some great resources we created so that you can share this information with others. You know, we believe, like if the building's on fire and the kids are inside, I hope you guys would want to wake the town and let them know what's happening to their children. So that's why we created these.
I don't know if that includes, but I was wanting more information. You had one slide that talked about the statistics, you know, and because I find that so powerful in trying to communicate to people what the problem is that can't see it. So when you can tell them things like only 1/3 of kids can read, do you have more resources?
Yeah, that you can find all from the U.S. Department of Education's website. Every 2 years, they release their latest results, and for the last decade, every single year, every single time they do it, it's been less than 1/3 of the children are proficient in anything. There are whole school districts that cannot produce one single child who's proficient in reading or math. Believe it or not, Baltimore is an example of that. Not one single child. And this is by design, folks. When people say the schools are broken, no, actually they're working pretty well. They're taking about 90% of our kids with them, so they're not working perfectly, but they're getting pretty close. And they're the statistics, where did I put them? But yeah, you can find those right on the U.S. Department of Education's website if you want. You can get them for Florida as well. Florida is actually not much better than the national average. We're still down there. Everybody is, right? People think, well, my district is great. No, it's not. Go look up the numbers. You'll find that your county is just as bad as everywhere else. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, I think really hard is a relative term. Yeah, before I moved back to Florida, we were living in Sweden, and we watched them ban homeschooling. We watched them kidnap children from homeschool families. So the worst states here, states like Massachusetts, are outrageous. I mean, they force you to submit your curriculum for approval by the district. They force you to take a bunch of tests and things like that. So thankfully, we have not gone that far in Florida. I suspect we're going to see an all-out war on homeschooling probably in the near future. I think for a little while they tolerated us because, hey, those are the most annoying parents that are going to be at the school board and stuff. Let them go do their own thing. We'll come back for them later. But yeah, Florida's a good state to do this in. Ironically, some of the liberal states are even easier. Illinois, like here, you have several different options for how to homeschool. What we do, we just send a letter to our superintendent and let him know, and then every year we have to send in, we have to talk to someone who has a license to teach, and they have to talk to our kids and make sure they learn something. And thankfully, we have a lot of friends who have, the Florida license. But there are some states where you don't do any of that. You just don't send your kids, including Illinois, a very liberal one. But I'll just take this opportunity to just issue a very brief warning, and I don't mean to spark extra controversy, but there is a movement afoot now as they see millions of families fleeing the system to rope us back in, and the way they want to rope us back in is with free money. Exactly. Think of it like a cheese block in the mousetrap. Right? The reason the mouse gets his head smashed in is because he doesn't understand why the cheese is free. Same thing here. So I actually tried really hard, including with some of the people here in this room. I won't mention names because I didn't get permission, but we worked really hard trying to mitigate the damage of this bill. We found some success. It wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it still is very dangerous. To give you some sense of what's going on, I got 5 children that my wife and I homeschool. We are eligible to receive $8,000 per child for homeschooling. So we could get $40,000 per year of our neighbor's money to homeschool our kids. Well, we spend about $2,000, would be my guess, on homeschooling, all 5 of them combined in 1 year. I have no need for $40,000, much less taking my neighbor's money. But there's a trap. The original version of the bill, if you took the money, not only were you going to have to take an annual test that the government would assign to you, you're going to have to meet with a choice navigator who is going to assess the educational needs of your child. And frankly, I don't need anybody assessing the educational needs of my child. Right? My wife and I can handle that. So just beware of the free money, folks. Again, I know there are really good people on the other side of this issue. I tried to get the governor to stop it. I begged him, please. I met with him in Miami a few weeks before it passed, and he said they were going to work on it. They did put in some things to make it less bad, but ultimately, folks, we're moving very rapidly toward a disaster on this front. I watched it. I tell people I just came from the future. In Sweden, I watched them do this. They use the same arguments. Free go to private school. The taxpayer will pay. And then the trap door closed, and they said all private schools that are taking government money must now teach the government curriculum. No more Bibles, no more prayer. Get that stuff out of there. Taxpayers are paying. And that's what they want to do here. So they probably won't be able to close the trap on us next year. We might even have another 10. I don't know, but that's the direction they're going. UNESCO put out a report last year where they actually called on governments to start giving out free money to non-state providers of education. And they actually say the reason why. They want the government to impose equity goals, testing requirements, non-discrimination things. So they're not done with us. They're going to come for us. But to your question, right now we have a lot of homeschool freedom. And for goodness sakes, let's use it. So thank you. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys so much, and God bless you.